Okay, let's dive in. We're looking today at something pretty significant happening in the care sector specifically, the Applied Behaviour Analysis industry, ABA. There seems to be a major contraction, almost a structural failure underway.
That's right. It's a complex story, but the outline is becoming clearer. Boom, definite overreach, and now what looks like a bust.
And the flashpoint, the event that really caught our attention, happened recently in Arizona, didn't it?
It did. Around 3,000 workers at Arizona Autism, a major provider there, were laid off, and then almost immediately they were reclassified as independent contractors.
Right, the company called it restructuring, which is often the term used for these kinds of shifts.
Exactly. But what's really interesting and what our sources dig into is that this isn't just some corporate finance story. It's framed much more as a moral case study. There's this metaphor used, the canary song.
The canary in the coal mine.
Precisely. The idea that when the canary stops singing, you know the air's becoming toxic. Here, these mass layoffs, this sudden financial squeeze, it signals something deeper. Our research suggests it's the terminal stage of what's being called a control economy.
A control economy.
Yeah, an economy that ballooned incredibly quickly, perhaps became too profitable, and was built on, well, a pretty fragile funding source, as it turns out.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We want to trace how ABA grew from, a relatively niche therapy into this huge multi-billion-dollar market. And it seems the core mechanism was translating autistic difference, as they term it, into billable hours.
That's the crux of it.
And now we're seeing state audits ramping up, lawsuits coming from bodies like the OIG, Medicaid reimbursements shrinking, and it seems like the whole structure is starting to buckle. We need to understand why the air is thinning, to use that metaphor.
Well, every big boom like this starts with a promise, right? A financial promise. For ABA, initially, it was this allure of scientific certainty. Yes, the very marketable claim that human behavior, specifically autistic behavior, could be measured, reliably modified, and importantly, monetized. All through specific, replicable methods. They offered quantifiable results.
And that quantifiable bit was key, especially when laws started changing about 15 years back. Medicaid mandates, insurance parity laws. These basically enshrined ABA as the go-to evidence-based standard for autism treatment.
Absolutely. That was the moment the financial floodgates opened. Suddenly, the cost wasn't primarily on families or schools. It shifted to insurers and government health programs. It created this massive new market.
A market that capital definitely noticed.
Oh, immediately. Venture capital, private equity firms, they just poured money into the sector. They funded these huge chains of therapy centers.
And the business model itself.
It was pretty stark, really, built on, let's be frank, cheap labor at the bottom. These were often minimally trained technicians combined with credentialed supervisors at the top. This structure allowed them to effectively mine those guaranteed Medicaid reimbursements and insurance payments for maximum profit.
But that rapid growth, that model, it started showing cracks.
It did. Some inherent contradictions emerged. These sources point out it became sort of too medical for schools. They couldn't really handle the intensity and cost within their budgets. But at the same time, it became too educational for Medicaid, which started questioning if it was strictly a medical necessity versus, say, an educational service.
So caught in the middle.
Exactly. And maybe fundamentally it became too behaviorist for care itself. The focus tilted so heavily towards those quantifiable outcomes, towards normalization that funders could easily track, that maybe the individual's actual experience got a bit lost.
And that focus on billing, on quantifiable metrics, eventually drew the auditors in.
That seems to be the pattern. Federal audits started looking closely at this explosive growth. In states like Indiana, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, investigators found, well, troubling things. Tens of millions in improper payments, really significant documentation gaps, a lot of overlapping billing.
It sounds like the gold rush just outpaced any real oversight.
That's a good way to put it. The internal guardrails maybe weren't there, and eventually the government started asking for its money back.
Which brings us to a really specific, almost technical point where the finance hinged on language itself. We need to talk about ABA-Verbal Behaviour, or ABA-VB. This seems critical.
Yes, ABA-VB. This became a hugely significant and ultimately very vulnerable part of the industry's revenue stream. One source really nails it, calling it a billing innovation dressed in academic costume.
A billing innovation? Explain that.
Well, it cleverly positioned itself as a sort of hybrid therapy, one that could potentially be billed under speech therapy codes, which often had more generous reimbursement rates, or fewer restrictions.
And how did they manage that? What was the academic cost there?
It involved a technical redefinition of language. Instead of seeing language as this complex, holistic, deeply relational human thing, they recoded it, broke it down into these discrete, measurable units called operants. Things like man's simple requests, saying cookie and tax, just labeling things, like saying blue car.
So they essentially turned communication into transaction codes, little billable units.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
Meaning got reduced to a measurable response, something you could track, record, and crucially, bill for, often in these short, repetitive increments.
Wow. And the benefit for the companies?
Big cost savings. This recoding meant they could argue that technicians, not just highly paid, licensed speech-language pathologists, SLPs, could deliver this communication therapy. Language got, as one source puts it, stripped of its relational context and repackaged as compliance.
It sounds like a loophole, almost.
Well, it was certainly a financial...
Why specifically ABA-VB?
Because it ticked all the boxes for overreach. Auditors saw it was often duplicative doing work schools might already be doing. It was low credential, relying on unlicensed technicians for what looks like speech work. And frankly, the evidence for its unique long-term benefits compared to traditional SLP work was often questioned.
So the states pushed back.
They did. States started insisting if you want to bill under speech codes, you need a licensed SLP. That effectively pulled the rug out from under ABA-VB as a major billing category.
And the revenue streams just dried up.
Evaporated almost overnight in some cases. Those sessions that padded the bottom line were suddenly non-reimbursable.
This feels like more than just a financial hit. The sources talk about an epistemic collapse. What does that mean here?
It means the underlying ideas, the theory itself, couldn't really hold up once the financial scaffolding was removed. The argument is that ABA-VB wasn't necessarily built on a deep, essential understanding of language that communities genuinely needed.
No.
It was built on a monopoly of method, a monopoly propped up entirely by the fact that insurance had to pay for it. Take away the mandatory funding, and the fragility of the whole theoretical justification becomes starkly clear. The treatment felt essential mainly because the money made it seem so.
The market was saturated, billing got squeezed.
Exactly. And with costs needing to be cut drastically, the only lever left was the workforce.
Which brings us right back to Arizona and the present crisis. The state pulling back, but quietly. You mentioned Arizona withholding $133 million through revised assessment standards. That's austerity disguised as, what, program integrity.
Precisely. It's politically easier than announcing massive cuts. You just tighten the paperwork, make the standards harder to meet until the system effectively starves itself. It looks like efficiency, but it functions like austerity.
And this financial pressure leads directly to the gig work transition.
It forces their hand, yes. That mass conversion of technicians into independent contractors. The executives might spin it as giving workers autonomy, a chance to own their businesses.
But it's really about offloading costs.
Absolutely. It's precarity. You shift all the employer costs, health insurance, payroll taxes, unemployment, overtime liability onto the worker. It's the Uberisation of autism, as one source starkly puts it. The basic social contract between the company and the caregivers just dissolves.
And we have to talk about who bears the brunt of this. It's not felt equally, is it?
No, absolutely not. This is a critical point. The weight of this collapse falls disproportionately on families who rely on public programs, and specifically, our sources highlight African American and Hispanic families often being the most impacted.
Why is that?
There's an uncomfortable layer here. For some of these families, ABA, even with its flaws, served as a kind of shield, a form of compliance training, if you will.
I saw a shield against what?
Against institutional violence, essentially. Against schools or even police misinterpreting autistic distress or communication differences as defiance or aggression. ABA offered a script, a way to maybe navigate those dangerous interactions.
That's a really difficult insight. So losing that service, even a flawed one, leaves them more vulnerable.
That's the argument. When that state-sanctioned, albeit imperfect, shield disappears because the industry moves to a gig model that low-income families can't easily access or afford, it weaponizes inequality. The most vulnerable families, the ones who arguably needed consistent support the most, are left navigating this corporate wreckage alone.
So the collapse isn't just about dollars and cents. It's revealing something fundamental about how this care was structured.
Exactly. It suggests the legitimacy of the science, or at least this specific application of it, was deeply tied to the billing codes, to this illusion of precision.
Right.
When the money goes, the treatment itself seems to dissolve, suggesting the theory couldn't stand entirely on its own merits without that corporate and state mandate.
Okay, so if this massive corporate structure, this lattice of ABA, is cracking, what comes next? Is there anything filling the void?
Well, that's the hopeful part, perhaps. We are seeing what the sources call seedlings of different approaches gaining ground, things described as more relational, gestalt, meaning-based, approaches that were never really designed for mass extraction or maximizing billable hours.
So these exist outside that whole reimbursement machine?
Often, yes. You find them in smaller co-ops, community kitchens, local initiatives, mutual aid networks. Their survival isn't tied to profit margins or insurance codes. It's rooted in meeting genuine human needs, often in ways that aren't easily quantified. Their endurance is, you could say, a moral one, not just a financial one.
This sounds like a shift towards something else entirely.
It connects to this idea of the commons, contrasting the kind of top-down corporate surveillance logic of the ABA model. Measure everything, track everything with a different idea of support. Support as mutual stewardship.
Moving away from managing behavior.
And towards restoring relation, rebuilding trust. It's a fundamental shift in perspective.
So the canary silence, it isn't just a warning of toxicity, but maybe an opening.
An opening, exactly. An invitation to listen differently, as one source puts it. To think about care outside that command and control economic model. What's cracking isn't necessarily the human capacity to care for one another. It's the specific machinery of control and finance that was built on top of it.
A little light getting through the cracks, maybe?
Perhaps. And that leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, something to mull over, building on this idea of returning to relation to the commons.
Okay.
The ABA economy drilled deep into human difference, and maybe it mistook the dust, the data points, the billable hours for actual productivity, for real connection. Now that mine is emptying out, the air might be clearing. So if healing, if support is fundamentally about restoring relation, what other structures are out there in our society? Maybe structures that seem neutral, seem scientific, that are still poisoning the air we need to breathe together.
Something to definitely think about. What does care unmeasured really look like? What about language unowned? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.